Okay, welcome to Australian China Institute for Arts and Culture. My name is Tony Xiaoren. I'm a research fellow here, and I'm going to chair today's seminar. So I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodian of the land where we stand here today, and the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and pay our respects to the elders, past and present. So today we are very pleased to have Professor Michael Williams with us. He is recently appointed as adjunct professor of the institute. So so it's great that we have him in the team and his expertise in the Chinese Australian studies. This is one of the key areas of research in this institute. And we have, through Michael, organized a series of seminars on this topic. Last year we had a wonderful seminar by Michael, the opening seminar of this series, which is an overview of the field of Australian Chinese studies. And this year we are going to have 6 seminars in a chronicle order and covering different periods of time in the Chinese Australian history. And today it is the first seminar of this series of lectures. And Michael is going to talk about the very early years of the Chinese-Australian interactions. And he will talk about the issues like trade, discovery, labor, and many other interesting things. And we will have the rest of the seminar roughly at a monthly basis. So if you are interested, please pay attention to our website and advertisement. So we'll pay attention to the dates. One last thing before I hand over to Michael. You find some little gift from the Institute on your seat. So this is the exhibition there in the gallery. And the artist will have a workshop in the following week. So if you like her work, you can come to listen to more from her works. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and welcome everybody. And hope you'll enjoy the series. It won't be dull as Alice in Wonderland. Alice once thought history was. So, as Tony mentioned, this is the beginning of a series, and I just want to mention, apart from telling you what the basic rundown of the series is to, it's got of course a lot of dates there, but just to remember that dates are very arbitrary and shouldn't be taken very seriously. But I just want to point out one aspect of these dates is that some of them you recognise from Australian history, 1788 of course, arrival of the first fleet, 1851, beginning of the gold rushes. But then I've also got dates such as 1911, which is more important in Chinese history than it is in Australian history. And so just to show how events in China are reflecting back on Australian history as well. 1972, a date that combines Australia-China relations, for example. So it's a matter of interchange. The Australian history is all about the links with China as much as anything else. So the other thing I want to tell you is why a reflective history. So what I mean by that is that the present and the past are always interacting and reflecting back. So in this series, I won't, even though I'm going back to before 1788 or back to early 19th century, I'll also be talking about events in the present and how they influence our perceptions of the past. And that's because I believe in this other quote, which again, I maybe get people to guess where they think that one's from. The truth may be out there, but the lies are inside your head. And by that, of course, I mean that stereotypes and assumptions are very important in how we perceive history or how we try to argue about history. Misinterpretations are common and sometimes outright lies. And history is very often used and abused to meet the needs of the present. And certainly this is happening today, but of course it's always happened. And one perspective that I want you to remember that'll appear quite a few times throughout this lecture series is that China's weakness has influenced perceptions of the past, just as China's strength now is influencing perceptions today. So this idea, again, doesn't really matter whether China is weak or strong, or what it does with its strength, it's the perception that's most important. Now, I've entitled this first lecture, Before There Was Gold, The reason I do that is one of the most persistent stereotypes of the Chinese in Australia is that they're all gold miners. And that's the beginning and the end of the history as far as many people are concerned. And of course, like all good stereotypes, there's an element of truth in that. Of course, many were gold miners, and gold mining and the gold rushes are a very important aspect of the overall history, just as gold rushes were important overall in Australia's history. But there's a lot more to the story. And so the focus in this first lecture will be entirely on the period before the gold rushes. The focus here is the period before gold was discovered in Australia and even before Europeans began to settle in Australia. So this first period I'll talk about the pre-1788 up till around about 1818, and I'll be talking about three themes: discovery, trade and labour. I'll be asking a few questions. So one of those questions is, who discovered Australia? But more significantly, why is this important? Who is it important to? Also, I'll ask the question, who was the first Chinese person in Australia? And why is that an important question? And finally, another question that's always important, as important today as it was in the past, is it better to have cheap goods or higher wages? And this is a theme that runs right through Australian history and particularly involves Chinese people in Australia. So we mentioned Zheng He and sea cucumbers, we're mentioning seal furs and tea, the line of Parramatta, a modern artist, Zhou Xiaoping and his art, and again the long arm of the present with an example from former president of China, Hu Jintao. So, before there was gold, can this be very much? So as I said, we'll be talking about discovery, trade and labour. These last two elements of this history have continued to have an impact to the present day, but the first, discovery, is perhaps even more significant insofar as it impacts upon identity and the ability to, as it were, lay a claim to Australia and a role in Australian history. So, who discovered Australia and why does it matter? Well, this question is of course all about staking a claim. So you can see from this map, this is a map that existed before Captain Cook began his own voyages of exploration, and you can see from that quite a large parts of Australia were well known to the Europeans before Captain Cook ever arrived on the scene. But also we're going to look at the influence of tripang and Chinese cuisine, Zheng He versus James Cook, and Shou and Zhou Xiaoping. So going back, in 2003, the then President of China visited Australia and he made a speech before Parliament. And in that speech, probably much to John Howard's shock and horror, he declared that China had long since known about Australia, long before the Europeans. The Chinese had settled in Australia and had traded with Aboriginal people. Now this shocked quite a few historians as well, and by and large we thought the President was staking a claim in Australia. Now we don't know who was informing the President of China about this kinds of history, but by and large there's no evidence for that. But these kinds of claims, these kinds of the Chinese must have discovered Australia at some point, come up again and again. Another example is this figurine, the Shou, which was discovered in Darwin in the 19th century, late 19th century, or near Darwin in the late 19th century. And some people have speculated that this must be a Ming Dynasty figurine, and if it was, it must have been dropped there by Zheng He, or if not by Zheng He, one of his captains who sailed by and naturally discovered Australia, but then failed to mention it in their records. So again, this has been by and large identified as simply a soapstone figurine from the 19th century and was probably dropped there simply by one of the many Chinese people that were living in Darwin, in and around Darwin at the time. Now that doesn't mean there was no connection. In fact, there was definitely a Chinese connection with Australia that predates European settlement and invasion. So we have this record from a Dutch trader who was living in Timor at the time. He reported back to his Dutch East India Company, a Chinese trader returning from a trip to the south of 5 days sailing before the wind and 2 days and nights having drifted, reported to have visited a land of people who were very black and the hair very woolly. So obviously Timor is very close to Australia, and the Dutch trader simply announced, oh, he must have been visiting the Southland, which the Dutch trader also knew all about. So it's very probable that this is certainly evidence of the first actual Chinese person to have gone all the way down to Australia. Now the reason he was doing that is not tree palm, not sea cucumber. He was actually looking for tortoiseshell, this particular trader. So presumably these Chinese traders were wandering around looking for all kinds of things. But we do know about this connection back to China. It's well documented. It existed from at least the 18th century. Not necessarily done by Chinese traders directly, but by Macassans and others from what's now central Indonesian islands, travelling down to northern Australia, using Aboriginal people to help them to harvest the sea cucumber and then taking them back and trading them back up through Manila to China. So this is a link that of course is well known among Aboriginal people in the north. It's often declared a forgotten history. Every now and again you'll see an ABC article or something which will declare this to be a forgotten history, and they've rediscovered it. It's not so much a forgotten history as a history that for various reasons doesn't penetrate into mainstream consciousness. But it does, of course. It's very conscious as far as Aboriginal people are concerned, and it's something that's been well known for a long, long time. It went on, in fact, till 1906 before the trade was stopped by administrators in the Northern Territory. In fact, the Australian government had taxed this trade for many years, charging £50 in Singapore gold sovereigns right through the 19th century. When Matthew Flinders was circumnavigating Australia, he counted 80 ships coming down in the fleet to collect the sea cucumber. This had dropped gradually over the 19th century until finally a ban stopped it completely. And academics have known about this trade right through the 60s and 70s. Academics have constantly researched it, but again, it has to be rediscovered again and again. So you've got this idea of why people don't quite grasp this as just a normal part of Australian history. Another perspective that brings us back to a Chinese connection is the work of Chinese-Australian artist Zhou Xiaoping, who's been working with Indigenous artists such as John Bonham to create art based upon this history, and to hopefully use that art to certainly get the story out as far as the Indigenous people of North Australia are concerned, but also hopefully allow this story to penetrate more into consciousness throughout the rest of Australia. So what does these disputes about who discovered Australia tell us? What they tell us is that people are always trying to lay a claim. Now, it was common not so long ago that people just simply grandly announced that Captain Cook discovered Australia, and that was the end of the story. Right through the 50s and 60s, that was a common way of describing Australian history. And this, of course, completely denied any Indigenous discoveries or settlement in Australia for tens of thousands of years. And so this was, of course, all about the British and British descended people laying a claim and saying, well, we discovered Australia, therefore we own it, we deserve it, we deserve everything we get out of it. And that gradually changed in the 60s and 70s, and people began to talk about the Dutch and the Portuguese and other European involvements. And you remember from the map previously, quite a large part in mapping most of the coasts of Australia. But that was more about Australians wanting to distance themselves from the British and become more independent, and so by widening the scope a little bit, they were saying we're not so dependent upon the British. So it's quite natural then that Australians of Chinese heritage would begin to make their own connections and claims and want to make some kind of connection, whether it's a fanciful one through Zheng He or a more linked one through the traders looking for sea cucumber in the north. The other thing is to say is that as far as the Macassans and the northern trade is concerned, as I mentioned before, it's still a continuing confusion as far as white mainstream Australia is concerned. They still have this strong narrative that Australia was a completely isolated land. Yes, we recognise that. Indigenous people were here for 60,000 years, but they were completely isolated from the rest of the world until the Europeans arrived and reconnected it. And so they don't really know what to make of this Macassan connection, but Indigenous people know what to make of it, and they often use it as a way of distancing themselves from the European history and to say, well, we had other connections that predate that. This brings us to the First Fleet. This is a well-known connection. We go on to the story of the 11 ships that leave Britain in 1787 and sail down using the trade routes that had been opened up by the Dutch. The trade winds going on in the south, and Dutch characteristically turned north earlier. The First Fleet continued on to what's now Sydney. But what's not less well known is that 3 ships of the First Fleet in May of 1788 set sail for China. Now the reason they did that is because they were actually ships of the East India Company that had been hired by the British to take convicts to Sydney, and then once they'd finished with that task, they then naturally sailed on to southern China, to Canton, where many European factories existed, to continue their trade links and then continue back on to Europe. So this, from the very beginning of the European settlement in Australia, there was this connection with China. And this was not a fleeting connection, it's quite a strong connection. So for example, in 1821, Commissioner Bigg was sent out by the British to investigate the colony, which had been around for about a generation by that stage. And he announced, or he complained rather, that the high level of tea drinking, which he considered a luxury, was due to the existence of an intercourse with China from the foundation of the colony. And of course this is natural. For a colony stuck on the far side of the Australian continent, the nearest ports are either Batavia with the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies, or further up. There's no Hong Kong at this time, of course, but there was the port of Canton, which had many European traders. And this is connected in various ways. The seal there that I pictured is because, again, we often forget that Sydney Harbour and all the coast of Australia was full of seal populations in the early days, and they've all long since been hunted out. But in these early days, they began to hunt them and take the seal fur and traded it with China. So this was a major trade that went on in the early years of Port Jackson. And this Canton punch bowl, this punch bowl has a scene from about 1815 of Sydney Harbour. That bowl was manufactured in Canton, in Guangzhou. And again, this shows the link you've got here. This bowl was, of course, made to be sold in the European market. It's a big punch bowl on display at the Mitchell Library in Sydney. And you can see they've taken what would, to the Europeans or the British, would have been an exotic scene from the far distant colony of Sydney, placed it, used Chinese to manufacture it into a saleable market, a saleable commodity, and then shipped it off to Europe. So again, establishing this link that Sydney or the colony of New South Wales had with China. But of course that soon means a connection with people. Now, in recent times, as recently as 2018, there was a big celebration of the 200 years of the Chinese in Australia. And this was marked by the arrival of Mark Saying in Sydney in 1818. As a well-known person, a person with a name identification, links to Australian history. He ran a pub in Parramatta, among other things, called The Lion, right here, not far away. His family continues to exist in Australia, descendants today, most living down in Melbourne or scattered around, the Sayings. This is his grandson, John Joseph Saying, who is wearing the uniform of the New South Wales militia. So by the time he's grown up, he's obviously well integrated into Australian or colonial society. So this is all true, and this is all very good, and it's all helped people to establish their claims and links, just to identify with this Chinese person and say, well, Chinese have been in Australia for 200 years. It's a bit of a myth in the sense that he wasn't the first person. There were quite a number of other Chinese people. As I say, Sydney was trading with China, so naturally there were many people arrived as seamen, as traders and so forth, and we have their names, various names reported in the newspapers, but we don't know much else about them apart from that name. So Mark Saying makes a better symbol. And again, the point I want to make is that symbols and myths are good, but they have a purpose, and that purpose isn't always historical. Historians knew about Mark Saying for many years. I can remember looking at the papers from the Doyle family, who'd done their family history, and that had uncovered their ancestor, Mark Saying. It's now, the papers are all in the Mitchell Library. But historians knew about it, but most people weren't that interested. They became interested, became a fixture in Australian history when people felt they had some way of identifying. And that, of course, had to wait until much larger numbers of people identifying as Chinese Australians and wanting to identify with this history. So I'll just make some preliminary conclusions at this point, just before I continue on with the next section. So I just want to say, China and the Chinese have always been a part of Australian history, as we can see from these early trading links. But also, history is always a matter of being affected by the long arm of the present. And having a stake in Australia and laying a claim is very important. Identifying with the past to uphold the present is very important. But that means that history then has to deal with history versus myths and stereotypes versus details. So this is a constant with any kind of historical view of the world. And also, this point I want to make, that I've made with a few examples, of the resistance of popular history to academic history, which is to say, this idea of forgotten histories, you can't really forget a history if you've never learnt it. So by and large, the history is there. It's often buried away in academic journals or academic articles, or academics know about it, but they despair trying to get this out into wider popular domains until the ABC or someone else comes up with it. And they usually do a fair to middling job of presenting this, at best, a fair to middling job of presenting this history. And then it can often be forgotten again the next year, and then until yet another journalist comes along. So this kind of thing happens until there's a reason for perhaps holding on to this history. So as an Indigenous voice grows, so the Macassan trade becomes more important. As people identify as Chinese Australians, so Marxism becomes more important in history. So what I'll be doing as part of this series is I'll be suggesting some readings for people. These are just not definitive, of course, these are just examples. They'll go up on the website. There's an Australian Chinese history website.